On this episode of Travels with Bill, we're looking at what this is. Well, obviously it's broken. It wasn't a storm though, something else got it. So how'd we go from this?
And certainly a very difficult day for us, and we appreciate all the comments that have come in through Brandon and on the telephone lines and all of those things as well.
To scrap metal, it's the story of CKX Television in Brandon. For many years, this transmitter site along Highway 83 near Foxwarren was a landmark for people as they were driving by. The tower seen for miles and the CKX sign was always there, welcoming you as you passed. It's no more, just a field now. The CKX Radio 1150 sign that stood here for years may have made you think this was actually the transmitter site for a radio station. That wasn't quite true. This was the Foxwarren repeater for CKX Television from Brandon. It was a massive tower, but for years, a second tower was at the site too. Well, this is it. It's from a previous incarnation of the television transmitter when it used to be here and was a little bit smaller. This tower was eventually replaced with a much bigger tower. That bigger one is the one we all recognized as the Foxwarren Tower when we were driving down Highway 83. Well, of course, it's also Highway 16, isn't it? In this part of the world, the highway is sharing the same roadbed. It splits off just a little bit away from here. Besides the old tower, there was always an old transmitter building here too. In fact, there's an old TV antenna laying on the ground there. These things were here for years after they were decommissioned. I know a lot of people wanted that old tower, thinking it could make quite a nice little tower someplace else. Well, unfortunately, that never turned out to be. But how did we go from this to the much bigger tower to now no tower at all? Well, it's not really the story just of this site, it's the story of CKX itself. It was 1954 when Western Manitoba Broadcasters Limited, they owned CKX AM, received a license for a television station. It would operate on Channel 5 in Brandon with an effective power of around 20,000 watts. Well, it was many years later, on June 25, 1963, when a rebroadcasting transmitter was added at Foxwarren. That's what we're looking at here, the remnants of that original rebroadcasting transmitter, complete with this antenna that once upon a time would have been on the top of that tower we saw sitting in a big stack. Well, maybe you've never seen a TV antenna before, but this is what they look like. There's a lot of metal involved. It was 1979 when the CRTC granted an increase to CKX TV to change their Foxwarren retransmitter from the small one to the new big one, running almost 50,000 watts. The CRTC also gave approval for the introduction of local service to Dauphin and Mafeking from studios to be located in Dauphin. Well, if you know your TV history, you know that station was known as IMTV. We'll talk about them in a minute. Well, from the little transmitter in the little building to the big building of the big tower, CKX and Foxwarren was stretching further than ever before, but now it's gone. From a very technical standpoint, what brought the tower down was cutting this anchor off. Once it was cut, well, things were set in motion and nothing could be stopped. From here, a long ways from the tower, you can actually see the track in the field as it dragged those anchors away as the tower began to fall. If we move up a little closer to the second anchor position, you can see the guy wires here as they've all tangled around, and the second anchors here. In fact, we'll find that first anchor and just where it ended up with. These big towers are held up by these anchor cables, the guy wires they call them, and the anchors in the ground. Without them, the tower falls down. This one's still attached to the ground. That's what it used to look like before. See how a couple of the bolts had to be removed though? And there's that first anchor we were looking at that was cut. It held the top of the tower. Once it was cut, physics took over the rest. It can be a little surprising to see just how little metal needed to be cut to topple something so tall and so wonderful, but it's often how these things go. The smallest thing is all it takes to bring it down. Here's the top of the antenna where it actually hit the ground so hard it made a hole. We'll walk along the entire tower here so you can see how it fell and the impact damage. Every place you see the white, of course, that's actually fiberglass, part of the transmission system, and everything in red is the antenna. Once it turns into this, the normal looking steel, well, that was the tower itself. Back when this was built, it was much happier times for CKX. If you know your Brandon history, the Craig family was big into television, and radio too. And when this was built, it wasn't very long until they started to expand. In 1986, they received a license for IMTV in Portage la Prairie, and that moved on and eventually became all sorts of things. Maybe, though, no one saw the end coming. It was 1997 when Star Choice and Bell Express View were licensed to offer direct-to-home satellite service in Canada, and that truly began the end of this tower and the end of CKX TV. The problem was that people stopped watching over-the-air television. At one time, TV stations had huge towers like this and broadcast to the local area. You remember that. Sometimes they called it farmer vision. You'd receive 2, maybe 3 television channels at home, and you could choose to watch anything you wanted, as long as it was on one of those stations. Well, that meant all the eyeballs were watching the local commercials, and television advertising in Brandon, like everywhere else, was extremely lucrative. Enough money was coming in to fund huge operations with local newscasts, local sports, and of course, local towers that used up a lot of electricity to bring the signal to you. When direct-to-home satellite came along, it was a major shift in satellite. A few people had the big 6 and 8 foot dishes before then, but not enough to cause trouble for advertisers. Once everybody could have satellite TV, well, sets started turning away from the local station. With fewer people watching, there was less advertising money coming in. Only the lucky stations that were on satellite TV continued to have an audience. Their audience grew because suddenly a station in Toronto could be watched all over the country. But if you were a local station that wasn't on satellite, and CKX wasn't, it started to spell the end for you. Just a matter of time until fewer and fewer people were watching, and you had some financial problems. Dreaming big also cost the Craig family. The drive to establish a television network across Canada led to the licensing of a station in Toronto, CKX TV. You knew those as A channel for a while. Well, the losses in Toronto were huge. In fact, they were very huge. And on April 10, 2004, Craig Media was acquired by Chum because of the losses. As time moved on, Chum sold the stations to Bell Globe Media. By 2007, CTV Globe Media had acquired the assets and had been approved by the CRTC. The writing at that point was on the wall for CKX and Brandon. On February 19, 2009, CTV announced it would not seek the renewal of the license for CKX TV or the rebroadcasters at Foxwarren, Mercury, and Melita. It was in April of that year that the CRTC began hearings to consider the application for renewals of all the other CTV stations, and on April 30th, Shaw Communications announced they would buy CKX TV as part of a 3-station deal for $1. Things became grim for CKX on June 30th of that year when CTV announced that Shaw was not going to buy the station. There was one more try. Blue Point Investment Corporation offered to give $1 for the station. That was in July. Hopes were high that they would find an agreement with a satellite provider to carry the station on satellite, but they couldn't do it. On October 1st, Blue Point pulled out of the deal, and on October 2nd, 2009, CKX faded to black for the last time. The decision was made to leave CKX black instead of broadcasting bars or static, and it was black until technicians turned off each of its transmitters. Of course, by that time, most people were watching CKX on cable, and if you were watching on cable, you never noticed the black. Moments after the newscast ended, the signal was substituted with a Winnipeg signal, and for cable watchers, well, that was just the end of Brandon news and advertisements. The story of CKX, unfortunately, has been repeated in town and city after town and city throughout Canada. As local advertising dollars ended and viewers weren't watching their local stations, more and more had to merge and then close. From an era when television came to our country and had live productions and huge studios, to microwave relay, then satellite and fiber optic cable, finally to now watching on the internet, times have changed for television. From, well, really what was the golden age, to now watching the towers be torn down. Our story wouldn't be complete without mentioning at least a little bit of corporate greed. Many people wanted to acquire this tower, but to ensure no competition came along for other CTV stations, it was torn down instead so that nobody else had a chance. Our story wouldn't be complete without mentioning IMTV in Dauphin. Now, it was never its own TV station, it was simply part of CKX, but for people in the Dauphin and Swan River area, it felt like it was its own TV station. It played local commercials and had its own local newscast. This was seen in place of the Brandon News, well, at least it was until IMTV was closed ahead of CKX.
Good evening, I'm Wanda Michael and welcome to IMTV's 5:30 report for Wednesday, August the 12th.
Boy, does that bring back memories from being a kid and watching that newscast every night after school. Well, perhaps it's best to give the last word in this episode to CKX itself. As they shut down the station, they said goodbye and faded to black. We leave you then with that goodbye message, or at least a part of it, and the fade to black that ended the station and eventually led to the tower being torn down. Farewell from Travels with Bill.
CKX was Westman's only local television news. Our region stretched from the United States border into the Duck Mountain Provincial Park and from the Saskatchewan border east to Gladstone and beyond. CKX has been live from the Royal Manitoba Winter Fair to providing our viewers with live access to the Brandon Wheat Kings. Our noon show over the years has provided audiences with the latest in information and entertainment. But now we fade to black. So thank you for making us your choice at noon and 6 and allowing us to come into your home every day. A privilege we never took for granted. Good night.